Well, hello there, everybody. Steve the Amateur Story, and I'm coming to you from just the east side of 122nd Avenue, which means I'm in one of the most COVID-filled zip codes in the city. But obviously, if I stay away from people and just do my own thing, I'll be fine. Today, I'm bringing you a pretty tragic story. Not quite as old, some of my Historic Murders of Portland episodes, but this one takes us back to 1974 in what was arguably the most brutal murder case to happen in the city of Portland during the 1970s, and it happened in this neighborhood back in 1974. So we start things with, I believe it was pronounced Weeb was their last name. If I don't find any video or audio recordings, and individual I'm talking about has a very specific spelled last name, I'm gonna have to sometimes predict exactly how their last name is pronounced. And this family's last name was spelled W-I-E-B-E, so I think it was Weeb. Might have been Weeby, but I think it was Weeb. And the Weeb family lived in this area. The mother, it was a husband and wife, and they had 2 sons. And the wife was named Eloise Weeb, and she worked as a nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital. And because both her and her husband worked, and worked fairly early in the day, they needed somebody to watch their kids briefly. That little couple of hours before they would go to school, their kids were just a little too young to just kind of stay at home, and hopefully they would leave, catch a bus to work or walk to work. They lived pretty close to the school that the kids went to, so I assume they probably would have walked, or at least they would have walked their kids. So because of that, again, the Weebs needed a babysitter to babysit their 2 sons. Their sons were Todd, who was 10 years old, and Kevin, who was 8 years old. And this here is Lincoln Park. And right on the other side of this is Lincoln Park Elementary. So now over my shoulder, this is Lincoln Park Elementary School in Southeast Portland. I'm at 135th Avenue and Harrison Court, and this is the main entrance to the park. And this is the school that Todd and Kevin Weeb went to. Based on their ages, I would guess that Kevin was in 3rd grade and Todd was probably in 5th grade, or 3rd and 4th, 2nd. It really depends on when their birthdays were. But yeah, they were both students attending this school. And on the morning of March 25th, 1974, it was supposed to be just another school day. The Weebs were going to drop their children off at their babysitter, and ultimately the babysitters would presumably escort them here for their day of school. However, when Miss Weeb, the mother, got off her nursing shift at Good Samaritan, she was shocked to hear that neither of her kids made it to school that day. I'm now walking east on Mill Street. Lincoln Park Elementary is kind of back this way, just a couple of blocks. I'm like 2 blocks north and a little bit east of there, heading towards first the home where the Weeb family lived, which again wasn't obviously too far from that elementary school. So now approaching 140th and Mill Street, and this blue house right over here on the northeast corner, this is where the Weeb family lived. So again, according to the newspapers, the mother, Eloise Weeb, would have ran home to their home right here at 140th. Sorry, I keep having to put my mask back on because there's a lot of people out today. It is a nice day. But yeah, that's at 140th and Mill. Now, the people that the Weebs entrusted to... That guy got way too close to me. That they entrusted to watch over their children, again, just a couple hours before going to school. The Weebs both had to leave for work fairly early, and school usually doesn't start till about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and they would have to drop their kids off around, it was usually around 6:30, so it was just a couple hours of babysitting. And they entrusted their neighbors, Arlene and Howard Weeks, to watch over their children. Up until the start of 1974, both the Weeks worked regularly. However, Arlene Weeks quit her job right at the start of the year, and it was because they adopted a newborn baby, and she was going to stay home and take care of that new infant, a son of theirs named Brant. So she would be home, and they lived, both the Weebs and the Weeks lived really close to each other, so the Weeks would be entrusted with watching over Todd and Kevin Weeb in those couple of hours before they had to head off to school. So, reasonably speaking, Mrs. Weeb's next course of action would have been to go to the home of the Weeks to figure out what was happening, what was going on with her kids, why didn't they make it to school, why did she not know where her children were. So she would have gone from about 2 blocks down at Mill and 140th up to Market and 140th, just a little ways ahead, because the Weeks lived on the north side of the street, just 2 houses down from that intersection. And that's where I'm headed now. So this house, directly over my shoulder here, is the home where Arlene and Howard Weeks lived and would have been watching over the Weeb children in the early morning hours of March 25th, 1974. When Mrs. Weeb showed up at this house, she discovered one of the most grisly crime scenes in the history of Portland. Arlene Weeks was found tied up. Her wrists were tied to her ankles. She was laying on the living room floor, blood splattered everywhere. Her head had been completely bashed in with a blunt instrument. She was alone, isolated in that living room. Then in the master bedroom, Howard Weeks was found. Similar situation. He'd been tied up. His head had also been caved in. There was blood splatter everywhere. He'd also had a bunch of bedding piled on top of him, maybe the results of a struggle. And on the bed in the master bedroom were the bodies of Todd and Kevin Weeb, also tied up, also heads completely caved in. They'd all been just brutally murdered with a blunt instrument, all the exact same way. They'd all had their heads caved in. Now, whoever the perpetrator was, he obviously was not very worried about being seen because, well, first of all, at around 5:30 in the morning, neighbors reported hearing glass breaking in the vicinity of the home. I don't know how that would be related, or whether it would be related or not, because the Weeb children wouldn't even be dropped off for like another hour. But at approximately 7:15 a.m., again, the Weeb children would have been dropped off at around 6:30, so about 7:15 a.m., about 45 minutes later, neighbors on this street saw a man who was described as being about 5'8", so I'm 5'9", so comparable height to me, not very tall, about 160, 170 pounds, with dark curly hair that went down to about the shoulder. And he just walked out of this house behind me. Walked to his car. He had a blue and white car that he apparently parked really close to the house, and he walked down, got into his car, and left, and he just let himself be seen by people in the area and fled. So the police had a pretty stiff case on their hands, even with a guy that apparently was brazen enough to leave without obstructing his face. So just a horribly brutal crime that happened here. So this was a very strange case, to say the least. The Weeks had no enemies, as far as anyone would say. Nobody that would want to at least do something like this to them. They were just a young couple that had literally just adopted a son who was only a couple of months old when this happened. And Brant, their adopted infant, was found in another bedroom, safe at least. He was found crying in a bedroom. But whoever the assailant was, he either didn't know that Brant was in there or had just enough wherewithal to not kill the infant child in the house after already killing 2 adults and 2 children. There didn't appear to be anything stolen, so it didn't seem like a robbery gone wrong. And none of the victims had been sexually molested in any way, so that angle didn't work. There was no real explanation or motive to why this horrid murder happened. And the strange thing is, obviously I'm still going to talk and go deeper into it, but even now, the real motive behind what happened here is still very much left in mystery. But not long after these brutal murders happened, a man named Colin Hawkins came under the police's radar. And he lived in Gresham. He lived a ways east off this way. And apparently when the police arrived at his doorstep, he said words to the effect of, "I was expecting you," or "I've been waiting for you to pay me a visit," or something along those lines. Which is always a little bit of a red flag, but he, I believe initially, it was reported in one of the newspapers that someone left a tip about him. I don't know what that tip would have consisted of, but something that would have definitely helped put him under the police's radar is the fact that, again, as I said, before adopting their infant son Brant, Arlene Weeks had a job that she quit so she could raise their new adopted son. She actually worked for the state employment office, and again, quit at the end of 1973. And what's interesting is this Colin Hawkins fellow also also worked at that same office. So him and Arlene Weeks knew each other. But what was also really significant in the police ultimately arresting Hawkins, they arrested him about a week after the murders themselves actually happened, around the start of April. The biggest thing they found was, of course, police processed the crime scene and pulled 90 lifts of, things that could or might not be, like fingerprints. And according to the police fingerprint technician lab, they found a fingerprint belonging to Colin Hawkins, and they found a partial palm print also belonging to him. And these were both found in the master bedroom area where 3 of the victims were found. So, if there's any place that you're going to find the perpetrator's fingerprints, it's going to be in that room probably. And there we were. His prints were found. So he knew one of the victims. There was that connection. And his fingerprints were right there at the crime scene. When they arrested and interrogated with Colin Hawkins, he said, yeah, I knew Arlene Weeks, but I'd never been to her home before. I didn't even know where she lived. And that would end up actually setting the stage for the prosecution's case against them when this came up for trial. And the trial was supposed to begin in late June 1974, but it was delayed when Colin Hawkins' defense team, which consisted of Stephen A. House, who's fairly prominent local attorney. If there's a big deal case that pops up, you'll find Stephen House ends up popping up in that case somewhere a lot of the time. So he was the lead defense counsel for Colin Hawkins in this case, and they tried to claim that he had mental defect and that he was not guilty because of that. I never really found in any of the newspapers or any written pieces on it exactly what that meant, if that meant that they were just going to claim that he was insane or that he had a moment of insanity, you know, he snapped for a second, something like that. And so this delayed the trial as they had Hawkins sent to the state hospital down in Salem for 30 days of analysis. And by the time that was done, they completely ditched that defense and decided to just go forward with the defense that he was just absolutely innocent. It wasn't that he wasn't guilty because he was insane when he did it, but they decided to shift over to the defense that he didn't do it at all, which is pretty suspicious. I mean, if you were so convinced he didn't do it at all, why would you try to do the insanity defense unless you felt in that moment that they had no chance of getting him off? But then, you know, by the end of July going into August, when the trial was rescheduled, all of a sudden they decided to just argue that he was completely innocent. And it makes sense when you think about it, because the only real physical evidence they had on Hawkins were these fingerprints. And, you know, something else that was interesting, Colin Hawkins was a pretty slender, really tall guy. I mean, not 7 feet tall, but a tall guy. He wasn't 5'8", like the guy that was seen leaving the Weeks home. He also had very long, like way down his back, straight as can be hair. He didn't have shoulder length, curly hair. He didn't match the suspect that neighbors saw leaving the Weeks home. He didn't match. And that's a pretty serious problem too. So I could see his defense thinking, you know, all they've got is one fingerprint and a partial print, and they've got nothing else, and we have witnesses whose accounts don't match. Still in all, Hawkins ended up going on trial in August '74 and was found guilty. I saw that a friend of his testified as an eyewitness that the early morning hours before the murders happened, he was with Hawkins. They went to a beer and weed party and just got really drunk. But he said that they left and Hawkins was back near his home in Gresham, which is less than a 10-minute drive from the Weeks home. He was back home around, like, during the 5 o'clock hour, so he still would have had plenty of time to go to the Weeks home. Again, why he would just suddenly get home from a party and then just decide he's going to go kill people, or specifically rob a place, is a little weird too. You see, I'm not convinced this Hawkins guy did it, even though he was found guilty in this 1974 trial. And again, as I said, the prosecution's case was they went with the idea that this was a burglary gone wrong. Now again, nothing was missing from the Weeks home. As far as I was able to read, they had no reason to believe that this was a burglary of any kind, whether it worked or whether it went wrong, either way. But one of the things they had to go on was that Colin Hawkins had actually burglarized somebody else's home, but he'd done it over 2 years earlier. And apparently, you know, he wasn't really good at it, didn't really come away with anything, but he apparently peacefully surrendered. According to court documents, he peacefully gave up. So now it's a little over 2 years later. We don't really have any proof that he's tried, you know, burglarizing anyone else. Maybe he learned his lesson the first time. But this time around, he goes to burglarize a home, and he kills everyone there. And the prosecution's defense was, well, he went to this home not knowing that the Weeks lived there, not knowing that Arlene Weeks lived there. And the perpetrators believed to have crept in through the garage and then snuck into the home that way, which apparently Hawkins did in his first attempted burglary. And the idea prosecution put forth was that he went into the home, saw Arlene Weeks, and all of a sudden he was like, oh my God, this is not only a witness, this is a person who knows me, who will recognize me, and because of that, he brutally murdered her. Seems like a bit of a stretch. There's plenty of people who have tried robbing places, burglarizing places, who even though they get seen, they usually just run for it. Every now and then, they might kill a witness, but most of the time they just run for it. And why would he kill her and then kill the other 3 people in the house? who wouldn't necessarily even know him, especially the weeb kids. Why did he feel he had to kill everybody in the house? And furthermore, if he's robbing the place, you know, he sneaks in through the garage, gets into the house, and then sees Arlene Weeks. You know, whoever did this, you know, the murder weapon was found in the master bedroom. It was a hammer bought from Sears that the Weeks owned. So whoever did this killing likely snuck into the garage, obtained the hammer from that garage, and then crept into the home. It sounds very, at least whoever broke in, their desire to defend themselves seemed premeditated. That they would grab a weapon out of the garage and sneak in. But are we to believe that Colin Hawkins like snuck in through the garage and then crept into the house, then saw Arlene Weeks, and then suddenly had to backtrack to the garage to get a hammer? Do we want to believe that he would have gotten a hammer the moment he got there? And if he's sneaking in to break in somewhere, why wouldn't he have some kind of defensive weapon of his own? It was just there's just a lot of questions left unanswered by the prosecution's desire to claim that this was a burglary gone wrong and that these victims died because the perpetrator recognized one of them. It's not completely improbable, but it's pretty improbable. Now, to their case, it is interesting that 3 of the 4 victims all were presumably killed and left in the same room together, but Arlene Weeks was alone by herself out in the living room. Like, that gave her attack and murder, like, potentially some prominence. So, but even then, that's like all the prosecution case really had going for it, was the fact that she was killed over here while everyone else was killed over here. Despite how shaky it was, Colin Hawkins still was found guilty. Now, with a case that shaky, with so much relying on circumstantial evidence, it should be of no surprise that after Hawkins was found guilty, that they immediately put forward the process to appeal that decision. And there was a lot of things to appeal, namely the prosecution's whole argument that this was a burglary gone wrong because there was no real evidence that a burglary had happened. They didn't really prove their case. I feel like this is one of those cases, you know, it was such a big murder case. And when cases like this happen and they find someone that goes on trial, even if the case against them is weak, the general populace always believes they're guilty. And if you don't find them guilty, you can be, you know, attacked by, you know, your fellow residents. A lot of these cases, regardless of the evidence, people are found guilty. Because it didn't seem to me like there was enough here to automatically, for there to not be a little bit of doubt in a given juror's mind. The prosecution, you know, they also tried to put forward all these similarities between the cases that showed that there was a correlation, but really they had no proof that Colin Hawkins had committed any other burglaries in this one he had done more than 2 years earlier, 27 months earlier to be exact. So it would have been around the start of 1972. And this was March 1974. And the defense felt it was a little it's a little prejudicial to kind of base so much on the idea that this guy was like a, you know, chronic burglar when there was no proof he'd committed any other burglaries in a 2-year period. And essentially the correlations they found between his first attempted burglary and general details in the Weeks murder could have been comparable to any number of thieves or robbers. The fact of the matter is, whoever did it, there was no evidence they stole anything. So, you know, you can theorize that all you want, but you have no proof. But most importantly, this is what really, really, more than anything else, makes me very suspicious. That Colin Hawkins, who, from what I've read, unless he's, you know, passed away recently, he's still in prison for this case. And I don't know if I think he did it, because the biggest, you know, the one piece of real physical evidence they had against him were his fingerprint and his partial palm print. That was really probably more than anything else what did him in. However, these prints were not allowed to be viewed or analyzed by an independent party. I don't even know if anybody outside of the police department or the people that worked in their fingerprint lab that anybody really ever saw, because again, they did 90 lifts. These were only 2 of them. And apparently without getting the proper clearance, without getting the proper permission, workers in this lab destroyed 62 of the 90 lifts they got, more than 2/3 of all the lifts they picked up. And you know, these lifts hadn't been analyzed by anyone else. In a big case where if it didn't have a conviction and someone didn't go down for this, it was going to really look bad for the police. They needed to catch the guy and get a conviction out of this. And they destroyed more than 2/3 of all the lifts they got, and they said that the lifts they destroyed had no evidentiary value. But they're the only ones that know that. So that was a big deal in the appeals process, was that was the only real evidence you had. Even the witnesses that saw the guy leave the house described somebody insanely different than Colin Hawkins. So the one solid piece of evidence you have is now subject to deep scrutiny, because we don't even know if that's telling the whole story. And, you know, it leaves it open. You know, if, you know, not if, because these prints were, or these lifts were destroyed, what was maybe found in these lifts? Were they all of no evidentiary value? And, you know, we can't say for certain. We don't know if anything crooked and corrupt happened, but the fact that they did this so abruptly, and the fact that it seems like nobody else was allowed to see them, they didn't get the proper clearance, they just were like, all right, let's get rid of these. Boom, 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 they did it. It's very suspicious in a murder case when these prints from these lifts you got, that's the only real solid evidence you have against this guy. So even that has its problems. I don't see how anybody could not have like severe reasonable doubt in this case. So despite literally all of this, all of these questions, fingerprint evidence coming into question, the only physical evidence they had, the fact that the prosecution's case had no weight to it, the fact that Colin Hawkins didn't remotely match the individual seen leaving the Weeks home. You know, I found pictures of him around the time of his trial, which was in August. So you think March, April, May, June, July, August. It was 5 months later. Look at how long my hair is. Now, it's being held back a little bit, but see, it kind of just gets a little bit below my shoulder. I haven't cut my hair since the start of May 2019. So June, July, August. So it's been about 15 months since I've had a haircut, and that's all the length my hair has grown. So they say the perpetrator that witnesses saw had curly hair. Again, Hawkins' hair was straight as can be. Why do I still have this on? They said his hair was just about down to his shoulder. So probably just like, I'm seeing like Art Garfunkel type hair is what I'm envisioning. Barely just to the shoulder. Colin Hawkins' hair, by the time of his trial just a few months later, was not only straight, it was way down his back. You know, he had at least like 1.5 feet more hair than it seems the description of the perpetrator was. So are we to believe he grew like 1.5 feet worth of hair In 4 months? Unless he's dipping his head into a bucket of Miracle-Gro, I don't see how that's possible. There was nothing to definitively say that Colin Hawkins was the guy that committed this gross murder. 4 people, heads bashed in, caved in to death with a hammer. One of the most brutal ways to kill somebody. It was almost like a passion murder. And, you know, from what I couldn't find a whole lot of information about Colin Hawkins, but I certainly didn't find anything that suggested he was a psychopath, some kind of lunatic killer. He was just a guy who happened to know one of the victims. Probably didn't really do himself a lot of favors, saying like, oh, I was expecting you guys when the police showed up. But he was known as kind of a quiet, hardworking guy. He worked for a airplane firm. That was how it was described in the papers. It was described as an aviation firm in Troutdale. I did see in one newspaper, though, that Colin Hawkins, who was a very punctual, very reliable employee, never missed work. He apparently didn't come to work on March 25th, the day that the murders took place. So is that suspicious? Yes. Is that definitive proof that he's the killer? No. You know, especially when his friend says that they went out and drank all night. Maybe he stayed at home, you know, sick, throwing up with a hangover that day. I don't know. But I'm very suspicious of the official case against him. It seems like this is a case that was pushed, you know, to try to make sure that somebody went down for this crime. And if that's the case, that means whoever the real perpetrator was, you know, assuming he hasn't passed away yet, he's been roaming free for 46 years since then. And who knows, maybe he's killed some other people. I mean, the brutality of this crime, the either ignorance or cockiness of the perpetrator, that he would leave his car parked close by so it could be seen, that he would walk right out of the place where the killing occurred, not obstruct his face or anything, just walk right out there to be seen, shows a pretty high level of hubris that is fairly common in a lot of psychotic killers. You know, I don't really think it was Colin Hawkins at this point, but who was it? I have no idea. You know, it could have been somebody that was busted for something else different. Could have been somebody who was busted for a similar case in some other state, so they haven't connected the two. I don't know. And that's kind of unfortunately where the story trails off. I'm not saying Colin Hawkins absolutely didn't do the crime. I'm not saying certainly he absolutely did do it. But there's a lot of problems with this prosecution, with this trial, and the fact that he was convicted relatively easy twice. And it seems like nothing really has come of it since then. Of course, I don't know all the details of anybody else's investigations into this since the mid-70s, but as far as I've seen, this is kind of a forgotten case now, and nobody really seems interested in looking into it. You know, I think as far as most legal bodies are concerned, he was convicted twice, so let's just let it rest. Of course, how many innocent people have been convicted of crimes? A lot. So the whole, well, they were convicted, so it doesn't really matter anymore, doesn't really sit well with me. So, I don't know, this seems to be one of those kind of forgotten cases with a suspect that I think his potential guilt needs to be looked more into. And I think others who may have been in the area, lived in the area, who would potentially have the capability to do something this sadistic to 4 people who likely never did them any harm whatsoever. And why did it happen? We still don't know. You know, Colin Hawkins has been in prison for decades for this. We still don't know. As far as I know, he's probably still claiming his innocence, I would assume. You know, you can't really find a lot about this guy in recent years, but it's just very, very strange, and it's a case that doesn't sit well with me, and it's a case that deserves justice considering what happened to these people. So I feel like the official conviction needs to be looked into, and the possibility of others doing it also needs to be looked into. I mean, especially since, again, Colin Hawkins didn't remotely match the guy that witnesses saw leaving the house. You know, that morning, right around the time that these people were being slaughtered. So I feel like this case needs more attention. I know it's been a long time. I know there's a lot of other crimes happening. There's a lot of everything happening right now, but this case deserves another look from a, legal perspective. At least that's my take on it when all is said and done. So thank you so much for watching. I was doing a lot of talking. There was a lot of, obviously, again, a lot of issues in this case. So thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I appreciate it. And, if you know anything more about this case, feel free to let me know in the comments. Everything I do in this video is just based on the information that I was able to find. And there could be more out there. So that being said, remember, as always, to like, share, subscribe, hit my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. And until next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.